You know, whenever we decide to tackle a book from the early 90s, especially one that sits squarely in the self-help section, I usually find myself having to brace myself just a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a very specific aesthetic from that era, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's, you know the one I'm talking about. It's usually a lot of big hair, a lot of aggressive high fives, and just a ton of these, like, generic platitudes about believing in yourself and unleashing your power.
It was definitely the era of what you might call the sugar rush seminar. You know, you go, you get pumped up for a weekend, you feel like you can literally conquer the world on Sunday night, and then by Tuesday morning, you're back to being miserable because, well, nothing actually changed in your wiring.
Right, the environment changed for a couple of days, but the system didn't. So when we picked up Awaken the Giant Within, which was published in 1992, by the way, I have to admit, I went into this deep dive with my guard all the way up.
Which is completely fair given the cultural footprint of the author.
Totally. I was expecting the caricature of Anthony Robbins.
Yeah.
You know, the blinding teeth, the clapping, the firewalking. I was so ready for the fluff. But I have to say, after spending the last week just really dissecting this material, it is absolutely not what I expected. It is remarkably dense.
Dense is the perfect word for it. It is an absolute brick of a book. And I think that's probably the first major misconception we need to clear up for everyone listening. This isn't just a long pep talk.
No, not at all.
If you actually strip away the marketing, right?
Right.
Take away the late night infomercial vibe that surrounds the Robbins brand, what you find in these pages is effectively a highly structured manual for psychological engineering.
Psychological engineering. I really like that term. It feels much more accurate to what we're actually seeing in the source text.
It really is, because the premise here isn't just hope for the best and smile at yourself in the mirror. The core premise is that human beings are systems.
Like a machine or a computer.
Exactly. We have inputs, we have internal processing rules, which are our beliefs and our values, and then we have outputs, which are our behaviors and our emotions. And he is basically arguing that if you don't like the output, whether that's your bank account, your relationship status, or just your baseline level of daily anxiety, you don't just sit around and wish for it to change. You literally have to open up the hood and rewire the operating system.
And before we get into the actual schematics of how that rewiring works, because we are definitely going to break down the specific tools he offers, like neuroassociative conditioning and the triad, we really have to set the context here, because the author himself is sort of the primary data point for this whole system.
He is his own best case study, and it's a narrative that he deploys very strategically throughout the text. It's the classic janitor to helicopter story.
Which, I mean, it sounds like a movie script, but the actual details he gives are pretty gritty.
They are. And it's important to understand his starting point, right? We aren't talking about a guy who was born into wealth or had some massive network of venture capitalists waiting to fund his ideas. He describes his life in Venice, California in the early 80s. He's about 24 years old. He's like 30 pounds overweight. He's arguably deeply depressed. And he is financially completely broke.
Living in this tiny 400 square foot bachelor apartment.
Right. And the detail that always grounds it for me, the real texture of the situation, is that he didn't even have a kitchen in this place. He was literally washing his dirty dishes in the bathtub.
Bathtub lasagna pants. I mean, it really paints a picture.
It does. It paints a picture of profound stagnation. But then the timeline just snaps. He flashes forward to a very short time later, we're talking a matter of just a few years, and he's flying a jet helicopter over that exact same apartment building on his way to his own seminar, where thousands of people are paying to hear him speak.
And the core thesis of our deep dive today, and really of the book itself, is the explanation for that gap. How do you go from the bathtub to the helicopter? Was it just blind luck? Did he just win the charisma lottery? Or, as he claims, did he apply a highly specific set of principles, what he calls the master system, to bridge that gap?
That is the fundamental question. He argues that success leaves clues. It's not magic, it's pure mechanics. And if you understand the mechanics, you can replicate the result. He uses the central metaphor of the giant. And I think we need to define that immediately because, again, it sounds a bit mystical.
It sounds like a fairy tale. Awaken the Giant.
Right, like there's a literal monster sleeping inside you. But in the text, the giant is not some magical spirit guide. It is simply a metaphor for the dormant power of decision and the ability to control your own internal processing system. It's the difference between being a passive passenger in the car of your life and actually sitting in the driver's seat.
Okay, so let's look at the steering wheel then. The book is massive. It covers physical health, finances, relationships, but it all seems to pivot on one single central concept. If you had to pick the cornerstone of his entire philosophy, it's decision.
Absolutely. The power of decisions is where everything starts.
He makes a very bold claim right out of the gate. He says, I'm paraphrasing here, it is your decisions and not your conditions that determine your destiny.
It's a quote that ends up on a lot of motivational social media posts today, but in the context of the book, it's a very heavy psychological assertion.
I do want to push back on it for a second, though, because I think a modern listener hears that and immediately thinks, okay, that's super easy for you to say, rich helicopter guy.
Mhm.
But what about people facing genuine, crushing conditions? We're talking systemic poverty, chronic illness, oppression. Is he seriously saying those conditions just don't matter?
It's a crucial distinction to make, and one that honestly often gets lost in the quick soundbite. Robbins isn't arguing that conditions don't exist. He's not saying the environment isn't exerting massive pressure on you. He is arguing that the conditions do not determine the final outcome. He fiercely distinguishes between the external event and your internal processing of that event.
Right, and he uses a metaphor to explain why most people fail to grasp this. He calls it the Niagara syndrome.
This is a terrifying visual because it's so accurate to how many of us actually live our lives. He says to imagine life is a fast-moving river, and most people just jump into this river without ever looking at a map or deciding where they actually want to end up.
They just float.
They just float. They get caught up in the current, and the current consists of current events, the economy, their parents' expectations, their own insecurities and fears. And for a long time, it feels totally fine. They are just going with the flow. It's the path of least resistance.
Until it isn't fine anymore.
Exactly, because the river is moving towards something, and usually by the time they hear the roar of the waterfall, which represents the crisis, the sudden divorce, the bankruptcy, the health scare, they are 10 feet from the edge. They have no oars, and they go over.
And his core argument is that the fall wasn't caused by the water. It was caused by the lack of decision upstream.
Precisely. If they had put their oars in the water 5 miles back and made a conscious decision to steer, they wouldn't be in the crisis at all. It's about moving from reactive living, where you're just waiting for the rocks to hit you, to proactive living.
But the word decision is sort of a fuzzy word in standard English, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, I decided to wear this blue shirt today. I decided to eat a bagel for breakfast. Is that the kind of decision he's talking about?
No, not at all. And this is where he gets into the etymology of the word, which I find fascinating. The word decision actually comes from the Latin roots de and cadere. It literally translates to cut off.
To cut off.
Meaning, a true decision is a literal amputation of alternatives. It's not just a preference. If you say to a friend, I've decided to quit smoking, but you secretly keep a pack in your glove compartment just in case you get really stressed out, you haven't actually made a decision. You have a wish. You have a vague interest in not smoking.
You haven't burned the bridge.
You haven't cut off the possibility of smoking. A true decision means the other option ceases to exist in your mind. It's binary. And he argues that we are actually making 3 highly specific decisions every single moment of our lives, usually completely unconsciously. The whole goal of this master system is to take these 3 decisions off autopilot.
Okay, let's audit ourselves right here. What are the 3 decisions that control destiny?
Number 1 is the decision of focus. What are you choosing to pay attention to right now?
Okay, focus.
Number 2 is the decision of meaning. How do you interpret what you're focusing on? Is it a problem or is it a challenge? Is it the end of the road or the beginning of a new one? Is this pain or is it a lesson?
And number 3?
The decision of action. What are you physically going to do to create a result based on that meaning?
Focus, meaning action. It seems almost too simple on the surface, but when you look at the real-world examples he cites in the text, the stakes are incredibly high. He brings up Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks is the quintessential historical example of decision versus condition. Let's actually look at her conditions for a second. Systemic segregation, the very real threat of physical violence, institutional oppression, no political power, no massive wealth. By all accounts, the river was pushing her with extreme force to move to the back of the bus.
But she made a decision.
She engaged the master system. Focus. I am not moving. Meaning, this isn't just about a seat on a bus. This is about my fundamental dignity as a human being. Action. I will remain seated. By cutting off the option of compliance, by amputating the alternative, she catalyzed an entire civil rights revolution.
It really illustrates that the true power of decision isn't dependent on your external resources. She didn't need $1 million to make that decision. She just needed total control over her own internal processing.
Exactly. And to show that this exact same mechanism applies to business and personal resilience as well, he loves to tell the story of Soichiro Honda.
The Honda story is almost absurd. Like, if you wrote it as a fiction novel, people would say it's way too much bad luck to be believable.
It really is a dark comedy of errors. So Honda is a mechanic in Japan. He invents this new type of piston ring. He puts everything he has into it, takes it to Toyota thinking he's finally made it, and they reject it. They tell him it doesn't meet their standards. It's garbage.
So 99% of people quit right there. They say,
Yeah.
I guess I'm not a good engineer.
Right, the meaning they assign is, I am a failure. The action is quit. But Honda decides the meaning is, I just need to learn more. So
Got it.
he literally goes back to school. He suffers and iterates for 2 more years. Finally, Toyota accepts the revised design. Great. Right. Success.
But then,
Then the Japanese government denies him the concrete he needs to build his manufacturing factory because they are gearing up for World War II. So what does he do? He invents his own concrete manufacturing process. He finally builds the factory.
and then he gets bombed.
Twice. His factory is literally leveled to the ground by U.S. bombers. And this is the part of the story that absolutely blows my mind. Instead of despairing, he rallies his entire team. They run out during the air raids to collect the discarded gasoline cans dropped by the American fighter planes because they desperately need the raw materials for manufacturing. He looked at literal bombs falling from the sky and saw resources. That is a radical, almost superhuman shift in meaning.
And then, just for good measure, an earthquake levels his rebuilt factory.
At which point, you'd think the universe is screaming at you to just stop. But the conditions still didn't matter to him. He pivoted again. Gasoline was incredibly scarce after the war, so people couldn't drive cars, so he attached a tiny little surplus engine to a standard bicycle. And that became the very first Honda motorcycle. He interpreted every single disaster not as a stop sign, but as a detour sign.
It's incredibly inspiring. But I want to circle back to the scientific skepticism for a moment. Because we know a lot more about neuroscience now than we did back in '92. We know about decision fatigue. We know that when people are in survival mode, when they are literally starving or terrified, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that makes these complex rational decisions, essentially shuts down.
That is a very valid scientific critique. Cognitive load is absolutely real. When you are actively drowning in the river, it is extremely hard to calmly design a boat.
So is it actually fair to expect people in severe crisis to just decide their way out of it?
It's a very heavy ask. However, Robbins actually anticipates this exact criticism, and he leans heavily on the work of Viktor Frankl to counter it.
Right, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps.
The author of Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl's core argument, which Robbins adopts wholeheartedly, is that you can strip a human being of literally everything. You can take their clothes, their family, their health, their food, their hair, but you literally, physically cannot take away what he called the last of the human freedoms.
Which is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances.
Exactly. Even standing in the gas chambers, Frankl argued, the decision of focus, where you actively point your own mind, is the one single lever that always remains under the operator's control. So while decision fatigue is a biological reality, Robbins would argue that surrendering that final freedom is the ultimate defeat. The giant inside you is the part of you that refuses to surrender that last lever, no matter the cognitive load.
So it's not necessarily about controlling the physical world around you, it's about fiercely controlling the internal camera lens.
Precisely. And that leads us directly into the next layer of the schematic. Because if we are the operator of this camera, what software are we currently running? What tells us how to interpret the world in the first place? That brings us to belief systems.
The power of beliefs. He describes beliefs as the guiding force of the entire system. But again, belief is a somewhat abstract word. How does he give it architectural structure?
He uses a very practical visual metaphor that I think works brilliantly. The tabletop.
Break this down for us.
So I want you to imagine a tabletop just floating in the air. That tabletop represents an idea, just a concept. For example, the idea, I'm intelligent.
Okay, I am intelligent.
If it's just a tabletop with absolutely no legs, it's not a belief. It's just a passing thought. It's wobbly. If the wind blows or someone insults you, it falls right down. You aren't intrinsically certain about it.
It's just an opinion or a vague hope.
Right. To turn that flimsy idea into a rock-solid belief, you need legs to support it. And the legs are your reference experiences. They are your evidence.
So for the belief I am intelligent, the legs might be...
I got an A on my high school math test. My favorite teacher told me I was bright. I solved that complex puzzle much faster than my older brother. I read a whole book every single week.
And the more legs you have, and the thicker and stronger those legs are, the more stable the table becomes.
And the more certainty you feel. Certainty is the operative word here. A belief is essentially just a profound feeling of certainty about what something means. If you have a massive table with 50 thick oak legs under it, that belief is rock solid. You don't even question it. It literally becomes your reality.
But here's where the engineering part comes in, which I found fascinating. He points out a massive glitch in how the human brain processes these legs.
A feature or a glitch, depending entirely on how you use it. The human brain is actually not very good at distinguishing between a real reference experience, something that actually happened to you in the physical world, and a vividly imagined one.
Wait, so you can build a stable table on completely imaginary legs?
You absolutely can. If you vividly visualize yourself succeeding at something over and over again with intense emotional resonance, your brain literally records that as a valid reference experience. You can stabilize a belief in your own competence before you've actually ever done the thing. This is exactly how elite athletes train. A basketball player will visualize shooting the perfect free throw thousands of times until they deeply believe they can make it, creating a synthetic leg for their belief table.
This connects directly to the most dangerous and also the most powerful type of belief he discusses in the book: identity. The core beliefs we hold about who we fundamentally are as individuals.
Identity is the governor on the engine. It literally sets the speed limit of your life. Robbins cites the consistency principle in psychology to explain this. We all have an incredibly deep subconscious drive to remain consistent with how we define ourselves.
So if I define my identity as a lazy person, I will subconsciously sabotage my own hard work just to prove myself right.
100%. If your identity is I am lazy, and you start working really hard on a new project, you will start to feel a profound sense of psychological unease. You'll think, wait, this isn't me. And you will revert to your baseline behavior. You'll start procrastinating just to restore that internal consistency.
He uses the smoking example here again, which really clarified it for me.
It's the perfect illustration of how identity works. If you are trying to quit smoking and you're at a party and someone offers you a cigarette and you say, "Oh, no thanks, I'm trying to quit," you are in serious trouble.
Why? Because you're still acknowledging the struggle.
Because your identity is still smoker. You are deeply defining yourself as a smoker who is currently suffering through the miserable act of quitting. But if someone offers you that cigarette and you simply say, "No thanks, I don't smoke," you have executed an identity shift. Smoking is now a behavior that is fundamentally inconsistent with who you are as a human being.
It's such a small linguistic shift, but it represents a massive structural change in the brain.
It does. And there is a really disturbing historical example in the sources that Robbins uses to show just how malleable identity actually is, even against our will. It's the study of the American prisoners of war during the Korean War.
Oh, right. This was the famous brainwashing study.
Yes. The Chinese captors wanted to turn loyal American POWs into communist collaborators. But they didn't just use brute force physical torture, because that often just breeds more resistance. They deeply understood the consistency principle. They used a slow psychological drip.
They started incredibly small.
Very small. They wouldn't ask a soldier to denounce his country. They would just ask a prisoner to simply write down a statement that was undeniably true, but maybe just slightly critical of the U.S. Something as simple as, "The United States is not a perfect country."
Well, nobody is perfect, right? No country is perfect. So the soldier writes it down. It seems totally harmless.
Exactly. But then the next day they ask, "Hey, can you just write down a few quick reasons why it's not perfect?" And the soldier does. Then the next week, "Can you read that list of reasons to your small discussion group?" Then later, "Can you write a casual letter to your family back home just mentioning these things?"
It's the foot in the door technique, completely weaponized.
Precisely. And slowly, over months, the prisoner's deep need for internal consistency kicks in. The soldier's brain thinks, "Well, I willingly wrote this down. I argued this in front of my peers. I told my own family this. I must actually believe this." They gradually rewrote their own core identity from loyal soldier to sympathizer and eventually collaborator without the captors ever really having to scream at them or beat it into them.
That is deeply terrifying. It shows how easily we can be programmed. But Robbins flips this concept, right? He says we can use the exact same psychological mechanic for good.
He argues that identity is not a fixed marble statue. It's a wet clay sculpture. We can intentionally brainwash ourselves into a better, more empowering identity using the exact same tools of micro-commitments and consistency. He brings up the Pygmalion effect in educational psychology to prove this.
This is the study where teachers were told certain kids in their class were gifted.
Right. Even though those specific kids were picked completely at random out of hat, they weren't actually gifted. But the teachers believed they were gifted, so they unconsciously treated them differently. They gave them more time to answer questions, more positive reinforcement. And the most amazing part is, the students picked up on that belief, adopted the new identity of being a gifted student, and their actual standardized test scores went up significantly.
The software literally drove the hardware to perform better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The identity shift preceded the capability shift.
So we have the power of decisions, and we have the structure of beliefs. But what is the actual engine driving the whole car forward? Why do we do anything at all in the first place? Why do we eat the chocolate cake when we know it's bad for us? Why do we skip the gym? Why do people stay in toxic relationships for years? This brings us to probably the most technical and central part of the whole book, neuroassociative conditioning, or NAC.
This is Robbins' proprietary branding for what is essentially a master synthesis of classical conditioning and cognitive behavioral therapy. The fundamental premise is entirely binary. All human behavior, without exception, is driven by either the desperate need to avoid pain or the intense desire to gain pleasure.
The twin forces, pain and pleasure.
That's it. Underneath all our complex rationalizations, we are basically just biological machines running away from the fire and running toward the food.
But if that's true, explain something like procrastination to me. Because we logically know that putting off the hard work will cause massive pain later. The project deadline is coming. The IRS is coming for the taxes. Why don't we just do the work to avoid that massive future pain?
Because the wiring in our nervous system is temporal. It's based on the immediate present. In the moment you sit down at the desk, doing the taxes is intensely painful. It's boring, it's confusing, it makes you feel incompetent. Putting it off and opening up Netflix gives you immediate, visceral pleasure relief, distraction, entertainment. Robbins argues we are controlled by immediate pain and immediate pleasure, not by intellectual, logical future calculations.
So we develop what he calls mixed neuroassociations.
Right. We want the ultimate result, like being completely debt-free, but we link intense, immediate pain to the process of getting there, like budgeting and saying no to dinners out. So we stay in a total deadlock. We take 2 steps forward and then 2 steps back. Forever.
Until we hit a threshold.
The threshold is the most crucial concept here. This is the exact moment when the pain of staying the same finally becomes greater than the pain of actually changing.
That terrifying moment when you look in the mirror and just say, I cannot live like this for one more second.
That's the ultimate leverage point. That's the moment the lifelong smoker finally throws the pack in the garbage. That's the moment the person actually packs their bags and walks out of the abusive relationship. The pain of the status quo simply became unbearable to their nervous system.
And NAC, as a system, is essentially a method to create that leverage artificially, so you don't have to wait for your entire life to fall apart to make a change.
Exactly. Why wait for the literal heart attack to change your terrible diet? You can use NAC to artificially link massive pain to the bad food right now.
Okay, so how do we actually do it? What are the specific steps to rewiring the brain on purpose?
Step 1 is you have to interrupt the pattern. You have to aggressively scratch the record. You cannot rewrite a neural pathway while the brain is actively playing the old loop.
And he talks about doing this very physically. If someone is stuck in a deep depression spiral or a craving loop, you don't just talk to them softly. You do something completely bizarre.
You scream. You throw freezing cold water on your face. You stand up and do a ridiculous dance. Robbins tells a great story in the book about helping a woman who was severely addicted to chocolate. He didn't sit there on a couch and softly analyze her childhood trauma with her.
What did he actually do?
Every single time she instinctively reached for the chocolate during their session, he would do something shocking. He might yell, "Stop P" at the top of his lungs right in her face, or make a sudden, loud, obnoxious noise. He completely scrambled the neurological signal. The brain goes into shock, like, whoa, what just happened? And that confusion creates a tiny window of neuroplasticity.
And once that pattern is finally interrupted and the window is open.
Step 2.
Yeah.
You have to link massive, unbearable pain to the old behavior and massive ecstatic pleasure to the new behavior. And he gives a very visceral, honestly almost cruel example of this from his own childhood to show how permanent it can be. The beer story.
Oh man, this is the one that really sticks with me. It's so extreme.
It is extreme, but it perfectly illustrates the biology. So his mother found out he was getting curious about drinking beer as a kid, and she had been secretly saving these warm, empty, disgusting beer cans for weeks. She catches him, And instead of grounding him or giving him a logical lecture about the dangers of alcohol, which wouldn't work, she forces him to sit there and drink the entire six-pack of this stale, disgusting swill right in front of her.
Warm, stale beer. That is brutal.
He's vomiting all over himself. He's crying. He's dizzy. He feels like he's dying. It was a completely horrific physical experience. But what did it actually do to his wiring? It created a permanent biological neuroassociation in his brain that alcohol equals severe sickness and death.
And he claims he never touched a drop of alcohol again in his life.
Never. Because the lesson bypassed his intellect entirely and went straight into his gut. It's purely Pavlovian.
It's entirely Pavlovian. But Robbins obviously asks, why wait for your mom to traumatize you into a good habit? You can do this to yourself using just your imagination. He calls it the Dickens pattern, like Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol.
Right. Think about Ebenezer Scrooge. He didn't change because someone gave him a PowerPoint presentation on charity. He changed because the ghost forced him to vividly experience the massive pain of his own future if he didn't change. He saw his own unmourned death. He saw Tiny Tim dying. You can do that exact same thing to yourself. You close your eyes and vividly visualize what your life will look like in 10 years if you don't quit that destructive habit. See the physical health problems, feel the intense loneliness, imagine the financial ruin. You make it so real and so painful in your mind that your nervous system literally recoils from the bad habit in the present moment.
Now, looking at this from a more clinical, scientific perspective, is NAC actually sound, or is it just a fancy motivational trick that wears off?
It actually aligns remarkably well with what we now know about the brain's physical structure. Habits live deep in the basal ganglia, which is the ancient, automatic lizard part of the brain. To change those habits, you initially have to engage the prefrontal cortex, the modern thinking brain. But you cannot think your way out of a deep habit forever, because willpower is a highly limited biological resource. You eventually have to retrain the basal ganglia so the new behavior becomes automatic. NAC is effectively a brute force psychological method of repatterning that automatic system quickly.
But there's a major trap here that he warns about called secondary gain.
This is a very nuanced psychological point. Sometimes we desperately want to change, but we don't because the bad behavior is actually giving us a hidden benefit that we aren't admitting to ourselves.
Can you give an example of how that works in real life?
Absolutely. Let's say someone is chronically depressed. Consciously, they absolutely hate being depressed. That's the pain. But subconsciously, when they are depressed, their family suddenly gathers around them. People bring them food, they get love, they get deep sympathy, and they don't have to meet the high expectations of their job. That's the hidden pleasure.
So the pleasure of the deep connection and safety actually outweighs the pain of the depression itself.
Exactly. That hidden benefit is the secondary gain. If you try to just cure the depression using NAC without addressing their deep human need for connection, the cure will absolutely not stick. The subconscious mind will eventually sabotage the happiness just to get the love and attention back.
So you have to find a completely new, healthy way to get that exact same pleasure, the connection, without relying on the destructive behavior to get it.
You have to rewire the entire route to the reward.
Okay, let's move to the actual tool set for the daily grind. Because let's say we've rewired the brain, we've made our big decisions, but we still have to physically wake up on a random Tuesday morning and function in the real world. This is where he introduces emotional mastery, or what he specifically calls the triad of state.
This is probably the most immediately applicable practical part of the entire book for a listener who wants to change something right now today. Robbins fundamentally argues that you don't have emotions, you do emotions.
Which, I have to say, sounds deeply counterintuitive at first. I don't feel like I actively do anxiety. I feel like anxiety sneaks up and attacks me out of nowhere.
That's the standard passive view of emotions. But he breaks human emotion down into three very mechanical inputs. The idea is that if you actively change the inputs, the output, which is the feeling itself, has to change by biological law.
And the very first input in this triad is physiology.
Motion creates emotion. This is his ultimate mantra. He asks you to vividly picture a highly depressed person. If you just look at their body, what do they look like?
Well, slumped shoulders, head hanging down, eyes looking at the floor, very shallow breathing, really slow tempo in their voice.
Right. Now, I want you to try to feel incredibly deeply depressed while you are standing up perfectly tall, pulling your shoulders all the way back, looking straight up at the ceiling, breathing deeply, and smiling as broadly as you physically can.
It's literally impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, you feel like a total maniac doing it, but you definitely don't feel depressed.
Because your biology simply does not support the psychology in that posture. He goes deep into how physical movement literally changes oxygenation in the brain and how posture alters testosterone and cortisol levels in the bloodstream.
So if you're stuck in a funk, his advice is basically don't try to just think your way out of it. Move your way out of it first.
Do 50 jumping jacks, go for a hard run, stand in a superhero power pose. You have to radically change the physiology first, and the emotional state will be forced to follow. It's the absolute fastest way to interrupt a negative pattern.
The second input in the triad is focus. We touched on this briefly with decisions, but here he uses a great visual called the party metaphor.
Imagine two people go to the exact same party. One comes home absolutely miserable, and the other comes home saying it was the time of their life. Why? It was the exact same room.
Because the miserable person spent the whole night focusing on the guy who spilled a drink, the fact that the music was slightly too loud, and the couple arguing intensely in the corner.
They are actively zooming their mental camera in on the pain in the room. The other person is focusing on how great the DJ is, the incredible taste of the food, the really attractive people dancing. They are zooming in on the pleasure. They both experienced the exact same objective reality, but they had two completely different subjective experiences based entirely on camera angle.
And he suggests using highly specific questions to manually control this focus.
Yes. He argues that the act of thinking is really nothing more than a continuous process of asking and answering questions inside your own head. If you habitually ask yourself, why does this terrible stuff always happen to me? Your brain functions like a supercomputer. It will find an answer for you.
It'll say, because you're stupid. Because you're fundamentally unlucky.
Yeah.
Because you don't try hard enough.
It feeds you a completely disempowering answer. But if you force yourself to ask a better question, like, what is actually great about this problem? Or how can I use this disaster to my advantage? Your brain is forced to immediately start scanning the environment for a creative solution. It completely changes your focus in a millisecond.
And then the third input of the triad is language, specifically what he calls transformational vocabulary.
This is the fascinating idea that the actual words we use to label our internal feelings literally dictate the biochemical intensity of that feeling.
I'll be honest, this one felt a bit semantic and almost silly to me at first, but the more I actually tried it in my own life, the more I saw his point.
It's incredibly potent. Think about it. If you walk around saying, I am absolutely enraged by this traffic, your brain takes that label and releases the heavy neurochemicals to perfectly match the word rage. High blood pressure, pure adrenaline, red face, clenched jaw. But what if you intentionally trained yourself to swap that word and say, I'm feeling a bit peeved by this traffic?
It's physically hard to maintain adrenaline-fueled blinding rage when you're forcing yourself to use a goofy word like peeved. It just sounds ridiculous.
That's exactly the point. The ridiculousness breaks the pattern. It immediately lowers the biochemical temperature. Or think about changing the phrase, I'm completely overwhelmed to, I'm just in high demand right now. Or changing, I'm so confused, I'm feeling really curious about this.
Curious is such a powerful reframe, because curious instantly opens the door to learning and playfulness, whereas confused just feels like a massive, impenetrable concrete wall.
Now, as the expert here, I do have to bring in a bit of clinical scrutiny. Does this heavy emphasis on reframing absolutely everything veer into what we now call toxic positivity? You know, the whole good vibes only crowd who flat out refuses to acknowledge when things are actually objectively terrible. Like, I'm not bankrupt, I'm just financially puzzled.
That is a very real risk, right? If you constantly reframe everything into a positive light, you might completely detach from reality and fail to fix the actual structural problems in your life.
It's a huge risk, but Robbins actually addresses this directly with what he calls the garden metaphor. He says, look, if your literal garden is completely overrun with toxic weeds, you don't stand there, close your eyes and chant, there are no weeds, I have a beautiful garden.
Because that's pure delusion.
Exactly. The weeds will literally eat your entire garden while you are standing there chanting positive affirmations.
So what is the actual Robbins approach to the weeds?
You look directly at the weed and you say, that is a weed. You acknowledge reality brutally and honestly, but And this is the key. You do not exaggerate it. You don't fall to your knees and say, oh my God, the entire garden is totally ruined. I'm a terrible gardener. Nature fundamentally hates me. You see the weed, you rip the weed out of the ground, and then, critically, you immediately return your focus to the flowers you actually want to grow.
So it's selective focus for the explicit purpose of operational efficacy, not psychological denial.
Exactly. You only acknowledge the problem long enough to actively solve it, and not 1 second longer.
Okay, so we have the state dialed in, we're feeling physiologically good, we're emotionally resourceful. Now we obviously need a destination. We need to talk about goal setting.
He calls it the ultimate success formula, which, yes, sounds incredibly cheesy, but the 4 underlying steps are just bulletproof logic. Step 1, clarity, meaning you have to specifically decide what you want. Step 2, massive action. Step 3, sensory acuity, which means noticing what's actually working. And step 4, flexibility, meaning you change your approach until you succeed.
It's that third one sensory acuity that I think people so often completely miss. They decide on a goal, they take massive action, and then they just keep violently banging their head against the exact same brick wall for years, even if the action clearly isn't working.
Right. It's the classic definition of insanity. You have to constantly look at the feedback the real world is giving you. Is this specific action getting me closer to the goal or pushing me further away? And then step 4, flexibility, is the real superpower of the whole system. As Robbins says, the person with the most flexibility ultimately controls the system. If you have the emotional resilience to try 100 completely different ways to open a locked door, and I give up after trying only one way, you will inevitably be the one who gets inside.
Now, regarding the actual goals themselves, Robbins says something towards the end of the book that I found really profound, especially for a guy known for immense material wealth. He says the true purpose of setting a massive goal isn't actually the thing itself. It's not about acquiring the Ferrari or the $1 million.
He explicitly writes, "It is not what we get, but who we become that gives meaning to our lives." And this is a massive, crucial pivot in the philosophy. If you set a goal to make $1 million, the real value isn't the physical cash. The value is that in order to ethically earn and actually keep $1 million, you are forced to radically develop your discipline, your financial literacy, your leadership skills, your resilience to failure. You literally have to become a completely different, highly capable person.
So even if the stock market totally crashes the next day and you lose all the money, you keep the upgraded character. You keep the new skills.
Exactly. The money is just a temporary byproduct. The permanent personal evolution is the actual product.
He also explains scientifically why the active goal setting works on a biological level, and he uses the RAS, the reticular activating system.
Yeah. Right. This is the brain's built-in search engine. At any given moment, there are millions of bits of sensory data flooding into your eyes and ears. If your brain actually paid conscious attention to all of it, you'd go completely insane in 5 minutes. So the RAS acts as a bouncer. It filters out 99% of the data and only lets into your conscious awareness what it has been programmed to think is important.
It's exactly like when you decide to buy a red car, and suddenly you see red cars everywhere on the highway.
Those red cars were always there. You just never noticed them. But now your RAS has officially tagged red car as highly important to your survival or goals. Setting a specific goal does the exact same thing to your environment. If you set a crystal clear goal to start a new business, suddenly you overhear a random conversation about wholesale suppliers in a coffee shop that you absolutely would have tuned out as background noise the week before. You suddenly see a magazine article about tax incentives. You are actively programming your brain's physical filter to hunt for resources.
That makes the whole concept feel so much less like magical manifestation and much more like deliberate biological programming.
Which is really the overarching theme of the entire book. It is intensely pragmatic.
One final piece of the puzzle I want to hit before we wrap up today. Motivation versus discipline. We've all had the seminar high or the New Year's resolution burst of energy on January 1st, and then it inevitably fades by mid-February. How does his system bridge that gap?
Robbins makes a brilliant distinction between push and pull motivation. Willpower is a push. It requires massive daily effort. You are literally forcing yourself to do something your brain fundamentally doesn't want to do. And that battery always runs out.
Discipline is a finite biological resource.
Completely finite. But if the why, the deep emotional reason for achieving the goal, is genuinely compelling enough, you don't feel a push, you feel a pull. You aren't forcing yourself out of bed to go to the gym. You are magnetically drawn to the gym because your internal vision of the end result is so viscerally pleasurable that you can't stay away.
So you actually need to spend way more time engineering the why then figuring out the how.
Exactly. If the why is big enough and emotional enough, the how will naturally present itself through the RES.
So just zooming out here, we've dismantled the engine. We've looked at all the wiring, the beliefs, the values, the NAC. Awaken the Giant Within. It's been over 30 years since it dropped. It sold tens of millions of copies worldwide. It arguably launched a massive, sprawling global industry. What is our final verdict?
It's a truly fascinating cultural artifact. On one hand, as critical thinkers, you absolutely have to acknowledge the valid criticisms of the industry it helped spawn. The modern life coaching world is completely flooded with pseudo-qualified people who read this one book, printed out a certificate, and put up a shingle to charge thousands of dollars.
Right, the whole business of self-help industrial complex.
Exactly. And there is a very valid, necessary critique there about credentials and psychological safety. But if you isolate and look at the actual source material itself, the actual text of the book, it holds up remarkably well because it's a masterclass in synthesis. He basically took cognitive behavioral therapy, classical Pavlovian conditioning, neurolinguistic programming, and ancient Stoic philosophy, and he aggressively packaged it into a highly accessible, user-friendly, high-energy manual for the average person.
He effectively democratized the elite tools of clinical psychology.
He really did. He shifted the broader culture away from passive analysis, lying on a leather couch talking endlessly about your mother for 10 years while nothing changes, to active, immediate intervention, the radical idea that you can change right now, today, that you are the operator of the machine.
That's the ultimate takeaway for me. It's about agency. The giant he's talking about isn't some mystical superpower. It's just the sudden, sobering realization that the controls of your life are actually sitting right there in your own hands.
And that choosing to leave those controls on autopilot for your entire life is in itself a decision with massive consequences.
So here is the challenge for the listeners we head out this week. We talked a lot about transformational vocabulary today. We talked about how changing just one single word can instantly alter your entire biochemical state.
Yes, the easiest tool to use right away.
I want you to look closely at your life and find just one word in your daily, habitual vocabulary that is actively dragging your energy down. Maybe you always say, I hate this, or I'm so anxious. But I think the biggest, most insidious one for most of us is the phrase, I have to.
Oh, that's a huge one. Change I have to into I get to.
Boom. Just think about the shift.
Yeah.
I have to go pick up the kids. I get to pick up my kids. I have to write this boarding report because I get to do work that pays for the life I enjoy. Just aggressively, consciously change that one single word for the next 7 days. Pay attention and actually feel the physical shift in your body's tension when you say it.
Because as the book reminds us, knowledge is only potential power. Execution is the only real power.
I literally couldn't have said it any better myself. Thanks so much for diving deep into the 90s with us today.
Anytime. Take care, everyone.